Then you click on and here we go. Here comes in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Here we go.
Hello, everybody. Welcome to RamonaSpeaks, The Other Truth. And we're going back to the Wild Wild West and bringing it forward to the present. Because, as usual, history has misinformed us. And tonight, my guests are the great-great-grandchildren of one of the most well-known, spoken about, made movies about person in the United States history, Jesse James. So welcome Teresa Duke and Daniel Duke to the show.
Thank you for having us on here.
Oh my gosh, I read both of the books. PDFs that I was saying. And I'm like, where's the movie?
Right, yeah.
Where is the movie? They are, for my listening audience, the authors of, I think, Daniel, you have several books out, but tonight we're going to be discussing The Mysterious Life and Fake Death of Jesse James. And we're going to touch on the Jesse James and the Lost Temple Treasures. Because I bet you guys didn't know that Jesse James was a Freemason. Yes. So let's jump right into it. Okay. How did this all start?
Well, Danny, do you want to go? Okay. Well, we basically have heard the rumors all our life that our grandpa, who we know as Grandpa Courtney, was really Jesse James. My mom heard it all her life. She passed it down to us. And one day she just decided she was going to, do some digging to actually, say one way or the other, we got to get this figured out. And so she just started digging up information and doing her research, and then me and Danny jumped aboard with her, and before we knew it, it was this information was coming just out of the woodwork, it seemed like, to help corroborate the story. And yeah, it just went from there. Okay. And then when she passed away in 2015, me and Danny we made a vow to continue her research and just continue on with whatever information we could find and just keep going with it.
Let's start with where Jesse James was born, and then we'll move to where he ended up. Great state of Texas.
Yeah, Jesse was born, and that part of history is correct. He was born in Missouri, Kearney, Missouri. It's just north of Kansas City. And back then it was the wild, it was the frontier country. So they're out in the frontier. He was born, raised on a farm, and then, as he started to grow up, before he was 14, there was a lot of fighting between the Jayhawkers in Kansas and people in Missouri. And it was over, the same reasons that started the Civil War. It was, free states versus slave states. And then, but just like any other war, the fighting, they say, started in Kansas and Missouri on that border about close to 10 years before the official start of the Civil War. And it was mostly, a lot of it was over land rights, and, people wanted to grab as much land as they could. And then they got political. You get into any kind of war, there's a whole bunch of different reasons for everybody, which is exactly like why Jesse and Frank and them got pulled into it. It didn't really seem to matter after a certain point what your politics were. If you were on the wrong side of the border and the other side was attacking, you got attacked too. So, Jesse was plowing in the field, and Jesse was about 13 or 14. He was plowing in his field, and a group of redlegs from Kansas rode onto the farm. They strapped him to the plow and beat him real bad. And then they took his mother, and there's varying accounts of what they did to his mother, but she was pregnant, and they shoved her around, whipped her, and stuff like that. And then they hung his stepdad. And they didn't kill his stepdad, but he was permanently brain damaged. So you could see a kid growing up in the frontier in a rough area like that, and he gets attacked. He wants revenge. But he was too young, and by that time the Civil War had just started. He was too young. Nobody would accept him. So he found a group who would, and that was Quantrell's guerrillas. And they were known as pretty much the bloodiest guerrilla fighters in the Civil War. And he learned well from them, how to ride, shoot, kill, and basically just guerrilla warfare tactics. Which, after the Civil War was over, he didn't. None of the guerrilla fighters were granted amnesty like most of the other, like the Confederate states. They were regular soldiers were granted amnesty, but the guerrilla fighters were basically hunted down like dogs. If you've ever seen The Outlaw Josie Wells with Clint Eastwood, that's a great story of how that happened for Jesse. I mean, for the intro on how he got started into his outlaw career. They were hunted down. He tried to surrender around the same time Abe Lincoln was assassinated. And when he was riding into Lexington, Missouri, he was trying to surrender, and they shot him through the chest. Somehow he escaped, and he lived. And after that, he and the rest of the guys around him, the younger brothers, or Cole Younger, Jim and Bob, and several others, they all decided to become outlaws. If they were going to be hunted down like dogs, they thought they'd go ahead and live up to the name and become outlaws.
Wow.
So their outlaw career went on for years. Nobody could catch them. Nobody really knew what they looked like. Even the only people who could identify them were their family, relatives, and friends, and that was basically their whole gang. So they had each other's backs. They got away. Nobody could really identify them. Then when it started falling apart, even before it started falling apart, Jesse tried to fake his death in 1879. And most people don't know that. His fellow gang member, George Shepard, claimed he shot Jesse in the back of the head in Oklahoma, which at the time was Indian territory. But he couldn't produce a body, and nobody believed it. And then somebody saw Jesse a week or two later in a different state, and the news spread like wildfire. So that attempt failed. And then in 1882, he finally was able to fake his death. His cousin, Wood Height, who bore a strong resemblance to Jesse, was shot in a gunfight with the Ford boys. But it wasn't, the Ford boys weren't hunting him. He was caught up in a love triangle with the Ford boys' sister, Martha Bolton, and Martha's farmhand, a man named Jim Gibson. So they got in a fight, Jim and Wood, and both ended up dead. And since he looked like Jesse, it was a perfect excuse to pass his body off as Jesse, and Jesse got to live under the alias of James Lafayette Courtney in Texas. And for the rest of his life, he was still dealing in other like the treasures and things, but he lived as a peaceable farmer until the age of 97 and died in 1943.
Wow. Like when I was reading the book, did his wife, your great-grandmother, did she know that he was really Jesse James?
I believe she did. There's a lot of, everybody in the family knew it, and she was real religious. And I think she always worried that he was going to burn in hell. Because some of her children even had that attitude afterwards. They thought he was going to burn in hell because he was an outlaw in the past. And and that brings up another story, a quick one. Jesse got kicked out of the Baptist church in his area years later because it was a birthday party for one of his daughters, and they invited their friends over, and he had an old Victrola playing music, and the kids were dancing. So they kicked him out of the Baptist church because the kids were dancing at the party, just dancing in circles. And he got kicked out of that. But even though they kicked him out, every Sunday he would ride to church and listen to the choir sing. So you know, it was he wasn't a real bad guy, but he also wasn't an angel either. I mean, you know, I guess he was just good at what he did.
Why did they refer to him at times as the Robin Hood?
They would help people. Like there was one story of a lady who owed taxes, and the tax man was on his way to take, you know, to get the money, and she didn't have the money, so they were going to take her place. So Jesse and some of his gang members gave her the money to pay her taxes. And after the tax man showed up, they hid out on the road. And when he was riding back to town, after she paid her taxes and got her receipt, they robbed him. So,
Also,
pretty cool story.
there's also stories that, like he would rob stagecoaches too. And when he'd have the people, you know, get out, he would look at their hand. They would look at their hands, and if they looked like, you know, hands that have never done hard labor or anything, they would rob them. But the people who looked like their hands had been, you know, workers, they wouldn't take their money. So the story goes.
When before he went to Texas, what were the names of some of the people in his family? Because I want to know what I've heard Cantrell several times. And there's such a strange name to me. I'm like, because one of his sister's middle name was Cantrell, right? And then I know that watching my favorite Tombstone,
I love that one.
The Cantrell name in that. And I'm trying to figure what is the significance of that name? Is that pertain to a person or just the gang?
That's a good question. I don't personally know the answer to the significance of it, but I do know a lot of people said his real name was Charlie Hart, but that falls into legend, and I haven't found any proof on the Quantrell, you know, which name was his real name. But I know he used William Quantrell, also said to have used Charlie Hart, and there was a couple of other variations of that he was said to have used. But I don't really know any significance behind it.
Okay, I was wondering if it was a family member.
I kind of get the feeling they were all kind of intermingled. I know that like when Grandpa took the Courtney alias, when they were in Missouri, they were surrounded by Courtneys. Courtneys infiltrated all throughout, you know, that area, and I kind of got the feeling that may be the case with the other gang members. You know, they're on such close proximity, and you know, I just have a feeling there were a lot of people who may have married some of their cousins, and you know, so on and so forth. But I mean, that's my personal theory.
Yeah.
Well, they were interrelated with the Courtneys and James family were related, and the real James L. Courtney just kind of fell off the earth. You know, it was hard to find. We found him later, and he was living. You know, he'd already married and moved on, but it was obvious he did a good job of trying to live low and low key and keep his name out of things.
Mm-hmm.
But I was going to ask you, like, have you guys done the DNA and located a lot of the spread out family members and compared stuff? Because I know your mom was threatened by the people who had that museum and had false news about everything. And tell me what, you know, how she explained that. That was cold.
Yeah, well, she had been, you know, she came out with her story, and we all thought that everybody would be excited to know that Jesse didn't get killed like history said. And she thought they, of all people, would have been the most excited, the people up at the James Farman Museum. And when she told them her findings, they didn't want to hear a thing about it. And then they just tried to act like, oh, she's crazy, don't listen to her. And they kept up with that. But every time they'd try to shut her down, she'd come back with more proof. And we all kept researching and digging, and she would come back with more proof every time. And finally, it got to the point where, they were harassing her. A couple of them sent nude photos of themselves to her and all kinds of crude stuff. I mean, it got real childish and weird. But eventually, they started with the death threats. And that's when, Mom knew, at the time I was younger and I wasn't going to put up with somebody threatening my mother. And Mom knew what I was thinking, so she called the FBI and they got involved, and that pretty much, the FBI took care of it very well and real quick. I remember they were mocking my mother. They didn't believe the FBI. She told them. I called the FBI. They didn't believe her. And they kept mocking her, saying, they haven't knocked on my door today. And then they'd start in with their stuff. And then one day they knocked on their door and everything shut up. So they got real quiet real quick after that.
Wow. So how did your mom find out, what were her best sources of information?
We have a diary. We have one of his diaries, and it's got a signature J. James in the diary, and it's like he was scribbling the signature, and it says J. James. That was one of the pieces of good sources that we have. And then we have some photographs that we got from some older relatives who lived on his farm. It was his granddaughter who lived on the farm. She had a lot of pictures, and we found a photo of his mom. So it was significant because his mom had a amputated arm. And it was missing from the elbow down. And before we went up there, we were like, if we find a picture of his mom with no arm, that's going to be really huge. And sure enough, we found that picture. And then we had the forensic artist compare the pictures, and they said they were the same people's. We even have one of her with the same dress pattern that compares to one of our pictures that we had. So it was... I'm trying to think, Danny. I'm rattling. But there was a journal, there's photos.
Yeah, they also, the photographs, like she went to 3 separate groups. The first one was the Texas Department of Public Safety, the Texas State Police. She went to their headquarters, and the lady who was the head of the forensics verified that our photos matched the historically accepted photos. And like Teresa had mentioned, down to the same dress, same print, everything. Jesse matched our pictures of his family members, matched the historically accepted ones, and then she took them to the Austin Police Department forensic lab. They verified the same thing, and she went to a third one out of New Jersey, and they were facial recognition experts who sold their software to airports and the military, and they also verified that our photos matched. So there was 3 groups of experts that verified all our photos matched. But she also went through, like Teresa had mentioned, the journal. All throughout his journal, he mentions people who were known James Gang members. And they even detail a robbing trip they went on through Shreveport, Louisiana, all the way, and then they hopped the river boat, went south on the river, got off. Every place he mentions that he went on that trip, there was a robbery that happened at the same time in the same place he was. And I thought, boy, that kind of gave him away on that part of it. But, it was his journal. I doubt anybody was going to make him, give up a journal. They didn't even suspect it. These days, I don't think you can get by with that, but it just amazes me. Oh, and here's a side story on the journal. When he was on his trip robbing in in Louisiana, he stopped at a man's house named Gervais Fontenot. And I thought, who's this guy? So I started looking up Gervais Fontenot, found him in census records and tax records back in the day. He was a retired U.S. Marshal. And I thought, why would Jesse be staying at the house of a retired U.S. Marshal? Well, then I got to looking deeper, and Gervais Fontenot was the nephew of the famous pirate Jean Lafitte. And that blew me away. So, and that ties into the side of it.
I think it's interesting to note what happened to Jesse's mom. You know, after they went through the ordeal when he was 14 with the Union Army militia guys attacking them and hanging her husband 3 and 4 times until he was brain injured. And the Pinkertons get involved because once they started robbing the trains and everything, the Pinkertons were hired to, which was like our CIA and you know, spy patrol at that time, came and threw a bomb in the house that killed his little brother.
Yep.
And his stepfather lost his hand, and his mom lost her left arm. Most of her left arm, or was it the right? One of them.
Yeah. Well, that's a big. It's kind of funny when you mention that. That was one of the tricks they kept trying to use on people. Which arm was it? And then they would kind of laugh, like, you know, the people at the James farm. And the reason they were tricking people with that, I don't know why they were tricking them, but a lot of the old photographs back then were always reversed. So it looked like it was one arm or the other. And when you would finally figure out, you know, the right way the photo should be viewed, it would show that it was, you know, the right arm. And then, we believe it was her left arm. And if you go by like ladies on the blouse, like my button's on the right side, women's are on the left, and things like that. And that tradition, for some reason, buttons have pretty much kept that tradition throughout the years. So you can use things like that to figure out which side is which. But they used to, I don't know why, but they thought that was their big ace in the hole. So
I don't think a lot of people realized how the photographs were taken and how they came out. And it could have been just out of plain ignorance.
And one of the other sources of information we have, I forgot. Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt. It just dawned on me. Sorry. We have a picture of him. It looks like a wedding photo, and his mom is in the background, and there's another picture of our grandpa in the picture with his mom, and we think it's his brother Frank in there as well, getting married.
Frank, that was at Frank's wedding, and they got Frank's wedding photo was taken at Jesse's farmhouse in Blevins, Texas. Big piece of evidence. And also, known people from Blevins, Texas were in the photo. I could talk about that photo all day, but the photo...
I saw that. That's in the book.
Yeah. One of the men in the photo, one of the guys who lived next door to Jesse, he was Bonnie Parker's grandfather, one of the guys in the photo. So Bonnie Parker, and it's historical record. You can go in the census records and all that and trace it back. He lived next door to Jesse. And I haven't figured out what their connection was, but that's a juicy story in itself.
Right.
Yep.
I mean, you know, when you think about it, unless Blevins was the place to go and change up, you know.
And one of my mom's aunts, when my mom first started, you know, researching, one of her aunts gave her one of Grandpa Courtney's treasure maps, and there was a picture it was a Bonnie and Clyde article that was tacked to that map, and we were like, that was kind of odd. Why was there a Bonnie and Clyde article clipped to it? So there's so many rabbit holes that we can still go down that we still are trying to piece together to this day. Sometimes it can get a little overwhelming.
Right, because one crumb leads to another crumb, and another crumb, and you keep on.
Yeah.
The one thing, you know, that you can take away from all of this and his life is the fact that people can change.
That's true. That's
Yep.
You
very
know,
true.
if they want,
Oh, yeah.
now it's harder this day and age.
Oh yeah.
You know,
Oh yeah.
you know, there's just no way, basically, unless you move
Oh, yeah.
up into the mountains somewhere, but you can't live among people and
Yeah.
change
And
your
sometimes
life.
that sounds kind of nice.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. You know, and you can reinvent yourself every day or whatever. But
Oh yeah.
he's a perfect example of people that live a certain lifestyle, but you don't live it until you die. You know,
Mhm.
what you
Yep.
do is you have enough sense to go ahead and do what you need to do to survive,
Right.
and count your blessings and leave it behind you.
Yep.
And that's what he did. And he was he was 90, 95 when he
97.
died, 97 when
97
Yeah.
he
years old.
died,
Yeah.
which is a lot better than being 30.
Oh
You know,
yeah.
A whole lot better.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. Uh, let's talk about the Freemasons and that mystery and the
Okay.
treasure map.
Well, that like Teresa had mentioned the treasure map that passed down through the family, and you don't have to excuse me. I was shaving before the show, and I cut my lip, so I hope it's
Oh.
okay. So, but yeah, the treasure map had passed down through the family, and it wasn't like a traditional what you would see on the movies. There's an old oak tree, and you 40 paces north of the tree, X marks the spot kind of thing. It was just a geometric design, like a rectangle with a bunch of dotted lines and dashed lines in it. And he would write in code how much was buried here, how much was buried there. Everything was in code. The code was easy to figure out. You just, substitute numbers for letters, and sometimes he would reverse it, and that wasn't too hard. But trying to find out where it was, there's no topographic markers or anything to go from. So I'd worked on that for years, and we found out about a group called the Knights of the Golden Circle, and they were said to have been kind of like a spy group for the Confederacy during the Civil War. Now, a lot of treasure hunters claim that Jesse was a part of that, and they claim that guys like Albert Pike and others were a big part of that. But I've never seen any proof that those guys were a part of that. It wouldn't shock me if some of them were, but at the same time, there's no proof. And just like a lot of groups like that, I think in a lot of cases, groups like that like to try to claim famous or well-known people so that it gives them a little air of legitimacy or something. And maybe even gives them a little sense of fear, makes other people fear them a little more. But the story was, so I thought, well, I have no reason to disbelieve that at the time. So I started trying to figure out how they laid out their treasures. And to make a long story short, the former Attorney General of the state of Texas, Wagner Carr, he was very interested in Jesse and the treasures. And he had contacted my mother. And Wagner Carr, my mother, had spoke for a few years, and he trusted her enough to he sent his driver out to show my mother and I where two large treasures were recovered. And one of them was just 12 miles from us. And I told my mom, and I used to laugh. It's like, dang, if we'd have known that when we were so broke when I was a kid, we would have loved to have found the treasure and got some nice steaks to eat.
Right.
So, but when they showed us the locations, they gave me 2 points on the map. And then an elderly gentleman who was a Freemason, 32nd degree Scottish Rite, and he was a World War II vet. When he was a kid, his name was George. When George Roman was a kid, he was about 10 or 12. Jesse, before he died, when he was an old man, hired George to help him bury he helped him move 700 bars of gold about 20 miles from his house. And he said he drew a map for my mother and I where that treasure was buried. And now, today, that treasure's on Fort Hood military base. So there's, Mom and I went out looking for the treasure, and we found out it's on a military base. And there's no way we're going to be able to hop onto a military base. But He said Jesse kept 20 bars for himself, and they buried 680 bars in the hole.
Wow.
So-
I was looking, I did a search to see, like, one of the train robberies he did netted, I think, $16,000 or something like that. So I looked to see, because that was pretty much his average take
Yeah.
to 35. And of course, the train people, the corporations are always going to lie about how much is gone, for
That's
the,
true.
replacement.
Yeah.
But it came out that in this day, it would be the equivalent of $500,000.
Yeah.
So he
What they
amassed,
claimed. Oh, I didn't mean to interrupt.
a lot of money, and
Yeah.
and you couldn't spend it because that would draw attention.
Yeah.
And then I read in the book where it said that he had like these gallon drums filled
Yeah.
with coins, gold and
Yep.
silver coins and stuff like that. And some agency or something had asked your grandmother or your mom to return some of that money.
Oh, yeah. After Jesse died, when Jesse died, it was in 1943. Half his kids stayed back at the house trying to find the treasures, digging up the yard. So they didn't even go to their own dad's funeral. They were trying to dig up the treasures. And
Yeah.
he had already known how most of his kids were. Yeah, just like especially somebody that most people are smart enough to know which kid's the backstabber and which one's the good one. So
Yeah.
he already had that taken care of, but it was 13 buckets of lard. And what he did, he poured the treasures in the lard buckets and then covered them with lard. Nobody thought anything of them. And then later they found out he left that to his wife. And the wife at the time was named Ollie. And she was a whole lot younger than Jesse. I think when he died, she was in her 50s. He was 97 and she was in her 50s. Well, she went off and lived a comfortable life, but it made them mad that she got the gold. So they wrote some agency asking the government to make her give those buckets back. And they wouldn't do it. So.
And while he was alive, we have some copies of letters from the government always questioning him about, because he always had, like, every year he'd have a brand new Ford car. He had, a lot of things that he couldn't account how he got those things, just being a farmer. And so the government, we have copies of letters where they were questioning him all the time about, trying to account how he's getting all this money to afford all this stuff that he had.
Yeah.
So,
but he also owned land and bought a lot of land.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
So, before he even got to here.
Yeah.
And so, that could have been a cover. And then I read where all of his kids, when they got married, he bought them a big farm or something like that.
Yeah.
Yep.
He buried money on each of those.
Yeah. And it's funny because we have one, she was his granddaughter, and I can't help it. He let them live. He let not just his sons and daughters, but the grandkids. He'd have everyone, if they wanted to live on the farms, they could. And he basically took care of all of them. And she was one of the ones who would with her husband, and she would bash him all the time. And we were talking with her, saying, "Well, he's a bad man. He's going to hell." But yet she sure didn't mind living off his farm and having the money that that this bad man take care of him. I don't know. It's just stuff like that.
Yeah.
He wasn't. We agree he wasn't an angel, but at the same time, I don't think he was all bad. And he was always trying to take care of his loved ones. And I don't know. It's stuff like that.
Well, it's easy, I think, because my thing is the Wild Wild West was not easy.
Oh yeah.
If you didn't come on over on the Mayflower that way, you know, bringing your wealth with
Yeah.
you. And
Yeah.
you had it hard.
Oh yeah.
So
Yeah.
in a land
Yep.
where it was go out and get what you can, however you can, and you know, whatever. I mean, people today are living
Oh yeah.
on the backs of victims of yesteryear, and they don't have a problem with it. So,
Yeah.
you know, regardless of whether they're burning in hell or
Yeah.
not, you know, you're living a lot better life than you would had it not happened.
That's right.
Yeah. Yes. Yeah. And it, you know, I think it was just the audacity that she was like, well, living off his land, but then bashing him. And I'm like, well, he took care of y'all for so long, you know.
Yeah.
You make a great point.
Well, and the other thing about the treasures, you know, like I'd mentioned, you know, that was when Wagner Carr had showed us, you know, had his driver show us 2 spots, and then George Roman showed us the other. Both of those men were Masons, and I got to think, we noticed after a while there were a lot of Masons contacting us, and we didn't really think of it much of it at first, but then, you know, we started putting 2 and 2 together. Jesse was a Mason under his alias, and then all these Masons that they just started coming out of the woodwork. So I eventually put 2 and 2 together, and it seemed like it. And I wanted to know more than just, I mean, who, you know, I wanted to find treasure. Anybody would, but at the same time, I wanted to know where the treasures came from, because there was a lot more treasures, like you had mentioned. The amount that Jesse had taken in his life, he had buried a lot more than he had ever stolen. And I thought, I don't know how that worked out until I started figuring out it was more than just Jesse. It was a lot of different groups tied in with Freemasonry, and they had buried treasures on a grid pattern across the Americas. And that I found out later, you know, tracing it back, it went back to Albert Pike, past him, to some of the founding fathers, not all of them, you know, the Masonic founding fathers. And then it went from them to Sir Francis Bacon, who a lot of people claim was the original author of Shakespeare. That in itself is a whole nother hornet's nest, but everybody agrees that Sir Francis Bacon was the founder of modern day Freemasonry.
Right.
And you know, if, you know, Freemasonry is inclusive of all religions, races, backgrounds, everything. And I always liked I'm kind of getting ahead of myself, but they had all been persecuted over the years by the Catholic Church, you know, back in the Renaissance days and even afterwards. But a lot of those guys had dreamed of a country where they could have liberty and freedom and speak their mind without the threat of losing their head. Right. So, you know, because anybody who spoke against the Catholic Church in the days are outside of what they believed was right and wrong, you could lose your life. So, and I traced it from Francis Bacon to his mentor, John Dee, who was known as the original 007. He was kind of like a wizard, a spy, alchemist, very smart man. And it went from him back through Jewish rabbis all the way to a rabbi named Rashi, who was the friend of Hugh, the Count of Champagne, who was one of the founders of the Knights Templar. And I thought, finally, I found the answer as to where it came from. But at the same time, I knew if I printed this, I thought, okay, people are going to think I'm really out there, because this is the mother of all campfire tales. So, but I went ahead and printed it, and I found out, and I was very honored, the head of the Grand Master of the Knights Templar today wrote a glowing endorsement for that book, basically stating that I had cracked a part of the code dealing with the temple treasures from Jerusalem. And that to me was the biggest honor I could have ever had. And it gave, you know, it also helped me. If people said I was crazy, I could just say, well, if I am, then so are all these documents, and so is, you know, the Templar themselves. So, you know, it was amazing. And it still amazes me today, the fact that I figured out a lot of that. It's just like information just kept falling in my lap.
So, having said that, has there been like major treasure hunts or people who have found caches of gold bars or anything that might be on that, you know? No names, of course, but
there were, well, like the two that Wagner Carr, the former Attorney General for the state of Texas, had, you know, the ones that he had sent his driver to show us. Those were supposedly, well, the one that was 12 miles from us was so big, according to the driver, it took several 18-wheelers, you know, the big tractor trailer rigs, several trips each to remove all the gold. But he never said exactly where it went. So I believe the state got it, but I don't really know.
Are they providing rescues? Let's see, how many years has it been since he passed away?
Since Jesse passed, 1943 to now, that would be 57 plus about 78 years.
Yeah. Okay, so let me ask, throughout all his time in Texas, is there any account of anyone that knew who he was and tried to blackmail him or whatever?
That's a good question. That's a good question. I don't know of anybody who tried to blackmail him.
That is a good question. I don't think I have never heard that either.
I don't really know. That's a good question.
Yeah.
That is a good question.
Because
we do know there were people who knew him though from that area. George Roaming, Danny.
Yeah. Well, George knew him, but George wouldn't have ever. George was scared to death of him. When George was a kid, he said, I honored him. He honored Jesse and he liked him, but he was also scared to death of him. He said he was a big man with a big hat and a big mustache and always had a big gun next to him. So that was enough to scare a 12-year-old real quick. So, but I don't know of anybody who ever tried to blackmail Jesse at all. I know there were some guys they called night riders. And they didn't like Jesse. He was under his alias. He claimed he was the real James L. Courtney was a Union bugler in the Union Army. And I thought, well, what better way to hide than to take the name of a Union bugler instead of a Confederate guerrilla. So, you know, he hid under that name, and we're not really sure why the night riders kept coming to his house, but they showed up one night and demanded that he come outside. And he said, hold on a minute, I'm putting on my boots and I'll be right out. And according to the family legends, the way he said it scared the guys and they all rode off. And there was one other time where they invited him to a cookout or a picnic, and they tried to ambush him, and he knew what was coming before he got there. But it didn't lead to a gunfight. He got out of there. So.
Yeah. And well, I asked the question because, as we all know, has history and everything has taught us that when there's more than one person that knows a secret, that greed and envy and whatever else will rear its head, and somebody, you know.
I've often wondered that, just what you just said, I've often wondered if that applied to some of the treasures. Now, I know a lot of the treasures were watched and supposedly are heavily watched today, the large ones. There's a lot of small ones. I don't think they care as much about those, but the really big treasures, if the ones that are still out there, are probably very heavily watched.
Yeah.
So I know, it's
because I don't think just from what I've read, I don't think Jesse would be the type to just, if he had it, he would not be the type to go that long, because he'd know at any time he'd need,
Yeah.
there is an end, that he would have told someone.
He probably told one of his Masonic brothers. I know most of those guys knew, the men in his lodge. Not all of them, but the ones he trusted knew.
Yeah.
Most of the guys who lived in farms around him were former Quantrell's guerrillas also. So they all trusted one another. And it was almost like they each watched each other's backs. So
Right.
I know if a stranger rode into the area, they all knew it immediately. And I think he kept up that way of living until he died. But I do know like going back to the Robin Hood stories, George Roming said that during the Great Depression, at the beginning of it, the banks were failing and stuff like that in little towns all over America. And George said that Jesse and his friends rode around in fine clothes, and they had like what was that, the Model A's, the early cars. They would ride around in nice shiny cars, and they had plenty. They weren't hurting. He said they didn't show off their money, but just seeing their clothes and their cars told you everything you needed to know. But he said they kept the banks in the area solvent so they wouldn't fail, which also helped everybody else. So I thought, how weird is that? He went from robbing banks to helping banks stay in business.
Right.
I don't know if it was because they were in part of some group together, or if it was just out of the good of their heart. They were trying to pay back for deeds they had done in the past. I don't know.
Yeah. And that could very well be too. Do you know, because I didn't see it from the excerpts that I saw, but did he ever have a run-in with Wyatt Earp?
We had heard that he and Wyatt Earp knew one another, and I thought, well, that doesn't shock me. Just after you start reading, like Johnny Ringo was a distant cousin of Jesse's, and a lot of those guys were interrelated. Yeah, that shocked me, all of us, when we found that.
And I know that the younger was one of the last ones that Wyatt dealt with before he went out to California.
Exactly. And it was said, and I don't know if it's a fact or a legend, but it's claimed that Jesse and Wyatt had respect for one another. They weren't friends, but they respected each other. And just Jesse wasn't known. He wasn't the kind to hang out in saloons and, look. He didn't want to get in gunfights and have trouble. He tried to live low and just do his thing.
Right.
So I guess that could be a reason why Wyatt would have just let him be.
Yeah. And plus too, I think Wyatt Earp was kind of tired.
I think
lost.
so too.
He had lost, and California was the place to be, and why not just go out there? Like I said, you got to be smart enough to know when to leave the game and go ahead and live out the rest of your life.
Exactly.
You don't just stay there until you get arrested or get hung or get shot.
Yep. That's like some of the famous gunfighters in the Old West. That's exactly what happened to them. They didn't know when to say no and walk away, and they ended up dead.
Yeah. There was always somebody recognizing them and stuff.
Yeah.
And I was thinking too, because I'm into metaphysical type things. I was thinking that when he got shot in the lung, that really should have been a death.
It should have been. And that's the second time he got shot. Because there was no
antibiotics.
Yeah.
And, in the 1860s, 70s, I mean, even today when you get shot, I mean, it's a 50-50 chance of you surviving. But he got shot twice. That same lung got it again.
Yeah.
And I'm thinking he had to have an angel or something protecting him. There was just the fact that he did as much as he did and never got something was riding on his shoulder.
Yep, I agree. Well,
To
that's just like there was a documentary about Geronimo, the famous Apache chief Geronimo.
Right.
They said that when he was born, someone had a vision about him or they blessed him. I can't remember the details on that, but Geronimo would lead a bunch of men, head on into a bunch of U.S. cavalry, and people on both sides of him would fall. He would even have his horse would get shot out from under him, but a bullet never touched Geronimo. And they always said that he was protected by spirits that kept the bullets away from him.
Right.
And he died an old man too. So.
Right. And I think, what were you going to say, Teresa?
Oh, thanks. I was just going to say also, Grandpa lived to be, like 90, I think it was 97, but he was also just really tough. He was in wheelchair bound in the last couple of years of his life, but he'd still get outside and he'd get on his knees and he would chop the wood with an axe with his hands while on his knees. Yeah. And I mean, he was just like, I don't know if I think they were all just tougher back then. They lived harder lives and they were all just tougher, I think. But I think you're right. I think this little bit he had like an angel on his side and just also being like really tough.
Yeah, and I think too, because I mean, think about it. All of those, bank robberies, train robberies, getting shot. Very few of the gang survived.
That's right.
To an old age.
Yeah.
And the brilliance behind plotting out, because they say he was the brains of it all. I mean, it's just amazing. I think maybe one day he woke up and said, well, maybe I should put these brains to work on something, that's a little less dangerous, but just as profitable, because usually those kind of minds, just like a lot of the criminals today, some of them have brilliant minds.
They do.
And they could be just as successful in mainstream as they can in the underbelly,
That's
so to
true.
speak.
And a lot safer.
I think plus too, he had that religious upbringing also.
Yeah.
And you never lose that. So, I mean, I'm talking like I know him, but I mean,
we felt the same way. After all the research, we feel like we know him, and it's weird because we never talked to him, but we feel like we know him. So we feel the same.
Yeah, because that book, oh my God, that book is so good. Like I said,
thank you.
You guys out there listening, you really need to check this book out because it's just mind-blowing. Yeah. And I look at the fact of the genius of the person. I understand people have to do what they have to do in society, of their circumstances to get out of their circumstances. This man got out of his circumstances. He was pulled into it under awful circumstances. And, had I been him, I'd have done the same. Yeah. And a lot of people, I'm sure, I think that's where a lot of the anger stems from, and it's generational, to hold on to that. But I have to commend the man because he turned his life around and he lived to be a ripe old age after all that he's gone through. And it just is a lesson to be learned. Just because you choose one path, you don't have to, that doesn't have to be your end. And
it's funny, we heard that he has some other journals floating around. We haven't found them, but um, it was interesting because he, like you said, he lived to be so old. He witnessed a lot in life. Like in one of his journals, he mentioned the first flying machine. You know, talking about the first like plane and going from like the Wild West to see planes in the air. You know,
Yeah, because
just how long
he saw
my
movement.
James stuff is.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean,
Yeah.
wow. You know, everything. 43 television, you know,
Yeah,
moving
true.
pictures, you know, gone from horse and buggy and riding with guns on your hips to, you know, cars.
That's true.
He lived
he
to
never
see it all.
That's
The
true.
Civil
That's amazing.
War.
Wow. That's right, because and that blows us away from the Civil War to the beginning of World War II, and and everything in between that. And that to me is amazing. I mean, that's a huge chunk of history and some of the biggest pieces of history in our country.
That's right. So, the only thing he missed was the moon landing.
That's true.
Yeah.
That's true.
You know, he had a barn where he would collect newspapers and all kinds of stuff, you know, throughout history in this barn. And the barn burned down, and they suspect someone burned it down. It was foul play, but it's really sad because all the history that he had in that barn could have been, you know, it was just amazing the span of history he had, and someone burned it down. Probably looking for gold or something.
Oh no! In the family story is that one of his sons burned the barn down, and they called him Barn, the son. His name was Byron. Everybody called him Barn for short. And Byron wanted money. Jesse wouldn't give him money, so he got mad and torched the barn. And I always thought that sounded like a spoiled brat to me. You know, Jesse had one, you know, even though he stole a lot of the money that he had, he earned it. You know, he didn't get it easy. And then his son, and he's a strong man. And I've heard, you know, a lot of people have said that happens a lot throughout history. You'll have a strong character, man or woman, and they'll have children, and they always seem to disappoint them because they were handed everything instead of having to work for it. And but that goes into a sermon, I guess. But but yeah, one of his sons is said to have been the one who burned the barn down.
Wow.
It's sad.
Wow. So are there? Go ahead. I'm sorry.
Oh, sorry. I was just going to say, you had touched on how he had changed his life and turned. You know, he ended up doing good with his life. And I don't mean to plug Masonry, but I think Masonry had a big part in that. I became a Mason because of Jesse and all the research I'd worked on. And now I'm a 32nd degree Scottish Rite, but there's a lot of teachings in that pushes men towards, it makes you see that there's a lot more than just your own needs and you know, much more than shallow greed and materialistic things. There's a lot more in life, and it adds a lot of depth to you. So I think that may be a big influence on why he changed and turned around.
Right. Teresa, did your mom ever speak about what were the women's side of it besides your mom, because she seems to be the most vocal of the women of all concerned, but did she find out anything about the women that were behind these men and stuff? Because that's an unsung story, you know.
The only thing I can recall is his mother. You know, doing the research, she was a character in herself. They said she was a really strong lady, and had a really good personality, and you know, just she was a character in herself. And I think a lot of Jesse may have got a lot of his charisma from her. But she didn't put up with anything they said. Like, I guess she had to be tough both times. But that's the only one I could really think of that she learned a whole lot on. Can you think of anyone, Danny?
Well, there were a couple of women in Jesse's life. Jesse's mother, for example, like she was very outspoken politically. Anything she felt, everybody knew about it shortly after. But they said she would, and I don't know of any specific accounts, but it was said that she could knock a man out with one hit. And
she was 6 feet tall, right?
Yeah.
Yep.
Sorry.
Yeah, she was some strong pioneer stuff.
Yeah, she was over 6 foot tall.
6 foot tall, and she liked her whiskey. But if anybody bought her whiskey, she would act offended because that wasn't what a lady did. But she'd take it on the sly, but not out in open. She was strong, and also Belle Starr, the female outlaw. I mean, they called her the Queen of Bandits, and she was. It said that she was in love with Cole Younger, and there was people try to make claims about her, but she had lived a rough life too. Grew up in the frontier, and of course back then, if a woman got out of the role that people tried to force them into, kind of like putting them in a box that society thinks they should be in. Anything that jumped out of the box was, oh God, that's horrible. But I admired. Most people I think today should admire her and should look deeper at her. She was a strong woman. She did what she thought was right. And we were raised, if somebody's in the right and they're standing up for themselves and they're doing their best, they should be admired at the very least. Right. And she didn't play games, and she was loyal to her friends, her family, and her beliefs. So
yeah. And now she met an untimely end, though.
Yeah, they said that she was ambushed by somebody, but nobody ever knows who did it. Right.
But she did a lot. And also, too, you got to remember during that times, that's why Jesse's mom was pretty fortunate, because she was able to marry, and each time it was somebody, of a higher level in society, because the last one was the doctor. Yeah. And during that time, man, it wasn't like you could, let me go and get a job. That wasn't happening. You went to the saloons, or you became a mail order bride.
Yeah. And that was in the day when women, and that used to make my mom and grandmother mad when they just talk about it. Women basically didn't have any rights. You couldn't do anything, and land was considered the man's property.
Right.
And they almost considered like women were the property of their husband.
Well, they were. They were the property. They had no say in anything.
That's true.
Except for like the saloon girl owners, the tough girls, the bad girls.
Yeah, like Belle Starr.
Yeah, but the others don't. In fact, I know a lot of women don't really realize that it wasn't until the 70s when you were able to have your own credit card.
Yeah.
The 70s.
Yeah. I remember my mom and my grandmother especially, when Texas had Governor Ann Richards, and I usually stay out of politics.
Oh, I remember that.
Ann Richards made it where a woman, if she was being beat by her husband in the past, if she defended herself, she'd go to prison. And Ann Richards changed that, and they all, I remember my grandmother singing her praises.
Yeah.
My grandmother was the type, she drove around with a little pistol in her purse everywhere she went.
Yeah. Because it all started with burning dead when that woman burned her husband. It was big news. Yep. And only then did they recognize that just because you're married does not mean that you can. I mean, women have come a long way compared to where they were.
Yeah. In just the last 40 years, it's been huge changes.
Yeah. And they need to remember.
Long way to go.
They need to remember that, because it's easy once you forget to slip right back into that role. And I see it edging back towards that. If they don't stand up, that's why we have the, come on, you think about the whole instead of, what's right in front of you.
That's right. And you're right. People get a freedom and then they start getting complacent and they let it slip away. And and there's always somebody ready to take that freedom real fast.
That's right. That's right. Because it's all about power in this country. It's never about the common people, the working people. You may think it is, but you don't have any say about what they're doing up there, and nothing that any of them does increases the quality of your life if you're working, hard working, or poor. And that is something I think people need to understand, because there's no Jesse James in today, not like that.
Nope.
Or the Bonnie and Clydes, or whatever, that used to go against the establishment and bring it to the people.
Exactly. Need more of that.
But we can do it ourselves, because we close our pocketbooks.
That's true.
Close our pocketbooks, because that's where their power is in their pocket. And if we close our wallets to them, we'll get an ear.
Exactly. All of a sudden, they're more willing to help you or listen to you.
Yeah.
As long as you keep that dollar as a leash on them, so they don't run off and go out of control.
Right. That's right. And see, they're not. I think just the times are different. They were wild then. Even to live to be an old age was a feat in itself. But it's no different. If you look around now, it just seems like we're living in the same times, except for different little bitty circumstances here and there.
Yeah.
But it's still the wild, wild west.
It is.
Yeah.
It is.
Yeah.
It's wild, wild west. But like you said, it's like so different now, because now we have like Big Brother and everything's on camera. And I think that's, that keeps things where people can't go out and have like the Jesse Jameses and the Bonnie and Clydes, because everything's,
Yeah, so the new Jesse Jameses are the hackers.
Yeah, that's what I was
going to say. Yes, that is so true. Yes.
Groups like Anonymous and stuff like that.
Yeah.
I don't know. I just think that I think when the stories of old are told in a truthful and honest fashion, it helps the people of today understand where we've been and where we're going. And the fact that all times and all circumstances is about the people not letting a few rule them and taking away their communities and their villages and stuff like that. When you take away those things, it's an ugly situation.
Yeah, very.
It helps them, but it hurts us.
Yeah, and it's really not even good for them in the long run, the ones taking the power or the liberty, because it's going to come back to bite them one way or another. But it hurts everybody as a whole.
Yeah, and
I think that's why we're seeing, in the past couple of, the last 5 years, we're seeing more and more where people they're starting to not take their questioning and everything now. And, we see so much more, like, people are starting to want to fight back, because, there's just enough is enough. And yes,
but it's just a matter of, taking the time to stop and think, what is your enemy? Who is your enemy?
That's right.
Because it looks to me like they're all fighting each other.
Yeah.
And that's the craziest thing to do.
Yeah.
And I think back in those days, it was about the games. Because at one time, it's told that Jesse rode with 50 members,
Yeah.
for the big halls, 50,
Yeah.
50. You can get 50 now together, but they're not fighting for the right cause. They still
That's
don't
true.
really understand what they're fighting for.
That's true.
They're just jumping on a bandwagon and stuff. But what are you really angry at? What is it that you really want to happen? How is any of these people helping you and your family and your neighborhood? I mean, you got to think about all of that. You just can't say, well, I don't like him, so I'm going on this one. What is that one doing for you?
Exactly. Exactly.
It's kind of like, if you make a great point, it's kind of like one person starts something and the others just kind of jump in with it.
And have no idea why.
Yeah, exactly. Everybody reacts to little things instead of stepping back and looking at the big picture and trying to identify the real problem. And I was telling my girlfriend the other day, we were talking about anxiety. And I said, anxiety is nothing but fear. Anxiety, it seems like people all over the world, is a big problem these days. Anxiety is fear. And if you can identify that fear, then you can stop the anxiety. Exactly. And it seems real simple. I know it's easier said than done, but as long as you can identify that fear, then you're on the right track to fixing as individuals or even as an entire nation. So, and when people you've got so many groups, like say the vaccine, for example, there's people who are for it, people who are against it. And it's gotten so polarized where people hate each other over, if I tell someone I was vaccinated, which I was, there's groups of people who can't stand me just because I got
and they don't understand. They don't know why. See, that's the problem.
Yeah. And it's because some guy they listened to on the TV told them it's wrong. Things like that. I had a guy claim, you must be a liberal then. And I thought, it's none of your business what I am. But at the same time, why are you politicizing an illness? And I don't get it. But I think that's a perfect description of what's wrong with a lot of people today, the nation as a whole. Everybody's running around confused and they don't really know what they're afraid of. They hadn't identified their fear.
And they don't want to. It seems like they don't really have a community to belong with, because even within the community, thanks to those that have been in power, they have concentrated on dividing people, keeping people separated, because they don't want them to come together as a whole. And I have looked at some of the faces of people that they've caught on camera and stuff, and they look like they're stark raving mad.
Yeah.
Which is a lot different than being upset about a certain thing and wanting to get it. I mean, they look like they have lost their minds.
Yeah.
There's so much anger and stuff. And then they think, they watch movies.
Yeah.
And that fantasy fills their head.
Yep.
But you don't want to go out because you're no Youngers, you're no Jessies, you're no Daltons, you're no none of that.
Yeah.
And you're going to end up getting killed. You get out there and you think you want to do this and it's wild, but everybody has a gun.
That's true.
Not everybody's willing to use it.
Yeah. But, like the Old West stories, people look up to that. Like when I was a kid, I really looked up to that. I thought, man, I'd love to be a bank and train robber, when I was a kid.
Yeah.
But then I realized later, much later, that they had their own reason. They had reasons behind why they were doing things. It wasn't
Exactly.
just, hey, let's go rob a bank. They had big, it was a hidden war. Even after the Civil War ended, it was like different wars. And even during the Civil War, there were other fights within the fights. And
Right.
everybody, and it was people today seem to, like you were saying, they want to be like in the movies, but they're not finding a deeper reason behind, and
No.
they're not even bothering to identify why they would want to do something, or
What you
who the
mad
real
at?
enemy is. Yeah.
What are you afraid of?
Yep.
Why do you hate this person? Why do they don't ask themselves. They just, told, and that's what they do. And
Yep.
if that's the way you're responding, then your chances of survival is nil.
That's true.
Yeah, it seems like people are just taking surface knowledge these days and not doing their own investigations and research. And they're just, it's like if you look at Facebook, you see all the people just spouting memes and to show their support, like what they're trying to prove, but they don't really go in and actually research the facts. It's,
So simple
surface
research.
knowledge. Yeah, it is just surface knowledge that they're going off of and taking that and going with it.
And here's the thing, just like with Jesse and those times, it's always been the government that started it.
That's right. That is right. That's true.
And it's always been.
That is spot on. Spot on.
And it's no different than today.
Yeah.
And here we are, little puppets.
Yes.
Without thinking. And we all want to be the outlaws or this or that. But you don't have it in you.
That's true.
Because you're being manipulated as it is. So when you get into a real fight, what you gonna do?
Yeah.
What's your plan? See, they had a plan. They needed to survive. There was properties that needed to be saved. They had it from a big railroads that was coming in. People don't teach you that, but the Pinkertons were actually hired assassins. Just like they bombed his mom's house with a little boy in there, and an elderly woman and a man. They did that all over. See, those are reasons that you fight back. Yep. Because that put a fire in them. That was real. So you can't be mad at those people. And you're supposed to learn and observe and look at the past. You've had a reason, because this is blood. This is family history for you. Me, I've just been interested because I sit back and I observe and I read as much as I can. And I compare. And most people, they don't do that. They just take a side, oh, that sounds good, and never get into the essence or the spirit of the thing. Jesse had spirit. He had a reason.
That's true.
First, it was anger that drove him. Then it turned to something else, and he kept evolving.
Yep.
And that's why he survived, I think. Whereas everybody, if you don't evolve, if you don't learn, if you don't understand why you're doing something,
they keep,
of course, right. What he did wasn't right, but the reason behind it is understandable.
That's true. And like you said, if people who don't understand, if you don't try to better yourself, you keep doing the same circle. It's like a dog chasing its tail. But once you try to better yourself, even though you might not have all the answers, you elevate yourself a little each time.
That's
And
right.
I that's perfect.
That's
Thanks.
right. And that's what he did, you know, and he was wise enough. He watched his kids. He knew his kids.
Yeah, that's true. Even the church that kicked him out because of the kids dancing, when their church burned down later on, a lightning or a brush fire burned it down, he rebuilt the church. He gave them the money to rebuild the church.
Yeah.
They still didn't let him in, but they took his money.
Yeah, but see, he had a conscience. He
That's
just
true.
wasn't out there, you know, and that's the difference. He had understood why he did what he did.
Yep.
And
That's
when
right.
that, you know, and looking around and seeing where maybe they were headed, and after the reasoning behind it was no longer valid, he wisely said, it's time to change up.
That's
No, I
right.
think I want to live out the rest of my days. And I think that's what people in general, they need to really understand, you know, so you can learn by historical figures. And
that's
it
true.
helps.
And like you were saying, when people lie about history and hide the truth, you never really know the problems to look at because you don't have the whole story. So
Right.
if you don't have the whole story, how can you find the problem? And that could be one of the big reasons we're all running around in circles confused today. There's too
Right.
many secrets.
Right. Right. And that is why you're here today.
Yeah, that's true. That's
And that
true.
is why you have a story to tell. The one that history didn't tell.
That's right.
You know, and the truth. And it just would be so interesting to hear that's why my show is called Ramona Speaks the Other Truth. Because there's always that other side.
That's right.
And I think that what, you know, you can't always suppress truth. Eventually it's going to come out in the end. You know, it may take 100 years or more, but eventually it's going to come out in the end. I truly believe that with everything, you know. So I think it's just when it's right, the time is there and it's going to come on out. So, you know, it just happened at the right time, and we've been ever since then, we've been finding information and going with it. So
how I want moms to get her day.
Yeah. Yes.
Yes.
That's right.
So have you been talking? Have you written out a script? Have you talked to people? Have you, you know, is there something in the makings or in discussions?
At one time, Brad Pitt reached out to my mom. He was, you know, he's from Missouri, and he's familiar with the Jesse James story. And when she was alive, he reached out to her. He was very interested in doing her side of the story, but at the last, you know, something came up and he decided to go with the traditional story of Jesse James, that movie that he did. But he did reach out. He was one of the ones who reached out to her. And then everything was just kind of shut down, it seemed like, after that. So, but we're still trying.
Yeah, you know, because I think that would be a hell of a story, because it's real, and it was a woman that was being pitted against the good old boy establishment.
That's true.
Trying to keep
Yes.
the truth down.
Yes, and boy, they bashed her. They tried to use every little thing they could to demean her, and she just kept coming.
Yeah, and my hat goes off to her. I love women like that. You know.
Thank you.
And I think Jesse's mom's also.
Oh yeah.
You know, let's look at all that. See, these are real stories told from the family view and the side of it. And I really want to push you guys to really get it out there.
I was on the History Channel not too long ago, America's Book of Secrets, but I was only on there for literally it was maybe 1 minute, you know. So
Yeah.
it was they interviewed me. It was a long interview, but they just show little bites here and there. But that's a start, and we're still pushing. There's nothing in the works right now, but other than my third book, which will be coming out next summer. But and that just goes deeper into powerful connections that Jesse was tied in with, both related through blood and by just associations. Like he was related by blood to the governor of Missouri, for example, who had put a price on Jesse's head.
On his head.
It's almost like it was a shell game. Keep it, you make it look like you're doing, one thing while in reality they were doing something completely different.
Well, doesn't that sound familiar today?
It does. Very, very similar.
Yes.
I mean, aren't we watching something like that today?
Yeah. It seems like ever since I've been born, it seems, just looking back through history and even in my time, that seems like exactly what politics is all about, a big shell game. Politics and banking. So
yeah. And all we do is we make them richer while we get poor. You know, it's like, there are people who rise up honestly, and they get lucky. It has no, because there's a million intelligent, hardworking individuals out there. So don't think that you're so special because you rose up out of, the bottom.
Yeah.
Because there's a lot of other people who have just as much skill and intelligence, if not more, that for whatever reason. So it wasn't all about what you did.
That's right.
So, people have a tendency to turn their nose up at people. Well, if I did it, you could do it. No, that's not true.
No. Everybody's circumstances are different. And what people need to do is build the foundation for one another, and they all rise.
That's right. That's right. So, from what you know about your great grandpa, what do you think he would be saying today? After listening to this and seeing what's going on, what would he have to tell us?
I think he would have been real proud of our mother for finding out the truth and finding the clues he left behind. I think he would have been proud of my sister. And
you.
Oh, well, thank you. But as far as politics go, I often wonder what he would have thought. I don't know. That's a good question. I don't think he would have liked what he sees today in politics by any means. I don't think, well, in fact, as I know back in his day, when Pancho Villa was riding in Mexico and raiding into parts of Texas and back and forth, he would write letters to some of his friends. And we saw one of them where he mentioned Pancho Villa, but he referred to him very respectfully as Mr. Vill. He called him Mr. Villy is what he called him. But I think he had a great respect for guys who were trying to do right by the people.
Yeah.
And if someone's trying to do right by the people, they had his support anyway.
Yeah. Yeah. And it's a catch, in order to do that, there's casualties.
Yeah.
In all things.
That's true.
To strive for something better or to get something changed and stuff. And it wasn't bad. especially during that time, because it wasn't all about slavery. It really was about money.
Yeah.
Slavery was the source of money for the South.
Yeah.
Um, and you had people fighting and dying in this war that were poor, that had
Yeah.
no that had no skin in that game
That's true. That's like,
because they
well,
couldn't work because they had free help.
that's true. And you look at most wars, they seem to boil down to power and money, almost
Yeah.
every war. And then what do they need to get the people fired up? They need to get them behind some idea. So they get, there were preachers on both sides. The preachers in the South were, they'd preach their thing and get everybody riled up. And then the North are doing the same thing. Before you long, it's not just the preachers, but newspapers, the media, all that combination of things whipping up a whirlwind, getting people confused. They all think they're fighting for liberty all of a sudden. One side and both sides seem to think they were fighting for liberty and freedom. So, and then you get a bunch of confused people killing each other. All the while, the money guys are sitting back comfortably watching it like a show.
Yeah, because this is what I think. Okay, all of that bloodshed, and guess what? Slavery continued. Once
Yeah.
the government that got in there, they made deals with the other people and started it right back up again.
Yeah. Yep.
After all of those
Exactly.
died.
Yep.
My grandmother used to tell us to stay away from debt. She always said, and it's hard. That's hard. I would try to tell her that's hard, and she would get mad at me. She said, don't get in debt because debt makes every man a slave.
That's
And
right.
I've always wondered about that because today, I mean, if corporations are so deep in debt, if one corporation falls, it makes a domino effect and they all fall. And, the rich guys, they might lose a few dollars, but they never really get hurt. It's always the little people.
They're
The
not
normal
affected
people.
by anything they do because
Yeah.
they make it so. They
That's
don't
right.
pass laws that's going to affect them. It affects
That's true.
us.
Yeah.
And the laws that affect them are the ones that increase the money in their pocket.
Exactly. Exactly.
And every other law affects us and affects us in a negative way that keeps us on that freaking hamster
Treadmill.
wheel.
Yeah. Yeah. Hamster wheel. That's true.
And that's, Jesse got off of it.
Yeah. He did. That's true.
I got off of it pretty much, because I live very, humbly. My parents, they live well off. But me, I'm on the property in the country,
Yep.
living my life like a
Totally.
monastery
Yep. Yes.
in my little
And you sleep better at night.
that I don't have to worry about paying any rent on, just worry about fixing it up.
Exactly. We sleep better at night too, don't we?
Yeah, the only thing I'm a slave to basically is electricity.
Yeah.
Because this is just too hot to not have any, because I've never lived in a place where I needed air conditioning. But and we will never, as common people, have any power if we don't control any parts of the electric, the water, and the gas.
That's true. That's everything everybody needs: food and water and the power.
And if you don't control that, you don't have any control.
That's true.
So what we need to do is make ourselves one great big game.
That's a good idea.
The gang of the people.
Yeah.
Everywhere, instead of, fighting among ourselves.
That's true.
Yeah,
fighting
exactly.
alongside of each other.
Yes, you bring up a great point. Like on Facebook, all the social media, you see all this bickering back and forth, but nothing ever gets resolved. Nothing comes out of this. It's like everyone just wants to prove, oh, I'm right. No, I'm right. And it's just a constant back and forth, and nothing comes, no resolutions come from all this bickering. It's pointless. It's just, like you said, if we could all get together and come up with like a gang and be, one with each other, maybe some things could change. Instead of trying to prove who's right and who's wrong. Sorry,
Yeah.
rant.
Yeah. I mean, my dream, make the land work for itself, even though you can't even own land. You think you own it, but you're still paying taxes
That's right.
past what you paid for the land.
Yeah, that's right.
But those are the things that people should be thinking about. Why am I paying taxes that
right.
now I paid more in taxes than I had paid for my land? Why does that even make sense?
That's right. I was telling my sister, I've been mad for months thinking about that. I said, you never really own anything like what you just said. You never own anything. If you don't pay your taxes, it's gone. The best we can do is rent from people. And we're renting our property, our homes and everything from the county, the state, and the federal government. And that's all you're doing, renting. And then I started looking at little, like island nations in the Caribbean. You can go down to some of those. They don't charge taxes.
That's right. And there are some states in the country, because I've been looking.
Yeah.
But, now, because when you own your land, your land is bought and paid for.
Yep.
That same amount, because I'm on 7 acres, that same amount is not going to, to get that, you'd be paying till the day you die.
Yeah.
In some places. So, you stuck with what you have. And I thought about, okay, you start thinking about solutions. What are some, if we turn our minds to actual solutions? I said, well, maybe I'll just do like tiny houses, make little tiny communities that are self-serving. You have in each little thing, you have the doctor, the vet, the carpenter, the electrician, people that, bring back the barter system. You don't need money, really. Very little if you working in a community together. You need skills, which is something that a lot of young people don't have today.
Nope.
Because they took that away.
That's true. That's true. Most of it's gone. They talked everybody into going into college for things that they didn't need and paying and getting in debt for college. And then they get out of college and they spend the rest of their life paying off that debt.
Looking for a job.
Yeah. And all the while, some other countries getting the jobs because we don't have anybody to do that job anymore. So because nobody knows skills, they're all learning how to do something in college instead of learning a trade. And plumbing,
trade. Nothing wrong with having you can have your college, but have a trade.
That's true.
To back yourself up.
Yeah.
And they took that away. No home ec, no shop, no metal shop, no auto shop, nothing.
That's true. I was watching investor Jim Rogers. He was a billionaire investor. I saw an article in the interview with him, and they said, what advice do you have for young people today? He told them, learn how to be a farmer. He said, if you get yourself a farm or know how to farm, the future is going to be bright for them. And he believes China is getting more powerful because they have more trades and farmers and farmers in America, especially, most of them aren't young anymore. They're about to die off. And so who's going to take their place?
The kids want to go to the big cities. They're tired of working on that farm, and that's the sad thing.
Yeah.
And then, the farmers, they should have stood together because, they allowed the government to pay them not to grow. Yeah. And then what happened with the last year and a half. All that stuff that they had in surplus, the ones, you know, they couldn't think of nothing to do. And my thing was, well, sell it to a country that doesn't have that. Put them on a ship.
Yeah.
Send it out. Sell it to them if you can't sell it here, although I don't know why you can't, you know, I mean, there were just ways. Nobody was helping think of ways to do it. I'm thinking, you know, I wrote, I don't know, I think it was some news thing that I just put in there. I said, put them on a ship and sell them to another country.
Yeah.
Or give it to them. You know,
Yeah.
you're talking about, oh, we have to kill all of these animals. No, you don't.
Yeah. You know, they
What do
did
you
that
mean
after.
kill all of these animals?
Yep. My grandmother used to tell me
greedy
they
and
did.
selfish in this country, and they're teaching the people to be greedy and selfish.
Yep. It helps their bottom line to keep them making money when they do that. And it's a waste. My grandmother used to get mad about that. She said back in I think it was around the Great Depression, they killed a bunch of cattle and milk cattle and stuff. They would just dig pits. The government paid them to kill their cattle.
And not give any of that meat.
Yeah. And my grandmother, she was living in a tent during the Great Depression. And she used to tell me stories. There was a gypsy lady she lived next to during the Depression. And the gypsy lady would teach her some interesting stuff, which is a whole nother topic. But her dad would go around. He had a job, but he'd go to the rich neighborhoods. And if he saw 2 bottles of milk on the back porch, he'd take one. And so he could get milk to his children.
Yeah.
And she always laughed about that, but it made her mad hearing when the government was killing milk cows and dumping milk out. Why? There were people who could have lived off of that instead of just killing it and wasting it.
Or making seeds that are dead.
Yeah.
Dead seeds.
Yeah.
You know, your fruits and vegetables no longer can. You know, I used to, for my little garden out here, you know, go to the store, buy tomatoes, slice it, you know, slice a piece off, put it in some dirt, put some dirt on top of it, and eventually here comes another tomato plant.
Yep. Yep.
You can't even buy seeds that will grow.
Yeah, they're all sterile.
Yeah.
It was heirloom seeds. My grandmother used to always tell us get heirloom seeds. Yeah.
Right. And I had to buy some, and I hope they're still good because I'm too scared to, you know, put them out there in case something like a freeze or something come and kill what I have. And oh my God, now the hunt is on for some more fertile seeds.
Yeah. My grandmother would have loved you. She thought a lot like you. She would have loved you.
You know, it's about, wow. It's just, that's why I said, you know, if the government would have left people alone, this truly would have been a great, magnificent place.
Yeah. Yeah.
That included everybody. Because there is enough here for every freaking body.
That's right. That's right.
The people out there don't go for the okie doke. You know, you gotta learn to love your neighbors and help your neighbors. I just can't stress that enough. You know, you got to bring some love.
And it seems like neighbors are being pitted against neighbors, you know? Yeah, it's like with all of the rhetoric that's going around, it's just, now it's like you said, it's just neighbor against neighbor now.
Yeah, because their power is slipping away. People are waking up. They can't lie and deceive anymore. And as soon as those crazies out there really stop and ask themselves, why are they acting so crazy? Why are you wanting to fight your neighbor, your fellow American? You know, ask yourself these questions, because they're not the enemies unless you are the enemy, because you're buying into whatever these people are manipulating you into.
Yes, it's a divide and conquer. I really truly believe that's a great strategy to keep everyone confused and weak. Divide and conquer. Yep.
It's working. And still, who's suffering?
Us.
Not them.
Nope.
Not too much.
Nope, they're just getting richer. They're just getting richer.
You know, it wouldn't have been a problem for people to have to stay home for just three or 4 months. Other countries did it. Canada did it, paid their people to stay home so they could function. We're supposed to be the richest nation in the world. Why we have to fight for half of what the normal rent is for a family of 4? Why we have to fight for that? We didn't even get that.
Yep.
Those are the things people should think about. Those are the things that Jesse would have said, oh no, boys, let's go. Let's ride.
That's right.
And it wouldn't be against his fellow people. He would hit the ones that had their big sacks of money hidden away. See, that's the difference in the thinking. So, is there anything left that you wanted to cover or you want to plug if you have a new book or whatever?
Well, I think we've covered most of it. I can't say much more about the 3rd book until it comes out, and I would beg you to let us on for that show too when the book comes out. I've really enjoyed this show a lot.
Me too. I know. This is like one of my favorites. Thank you so much for having us on here.
Oh, thank you for being
guest. You're a treasure.
Oh, thank you. I just wish, you know, I was thinking before the show, I said, gosh, I wish I had a campfire. This is something that needs to be sitting around a campfire discussing and everything. Yes, I there's just so much more, but I'm so glad that Mark Eddy had turned us on to each other. And I got to read the Jesse James and the Lost Temple Treasures and the Mysterious Life and Faith. I learned so much, and it's more about the man and the reasoning behind it, and it's just it's more spiritual than you really know. I mean, than people really know.
Yes, that's what. Yeah, it's more spiritual. Yeah. Like you said, you hit it, you pegged it.
Yeah. So I want to thank you, and let me know when that book comes out, and you can be right back here.
I will. I look forward to it too. I've had a lot of fun talking to you. This was my favorite show so far. So thank you.
Yep. Yeah. Thank you so much. I enjoyed tonight.
I'm so glad. I try to, my thing is to let my guests, you know, tell their story. And wow, it just was. My mom, my grandmother, and Zeraldo, I would love you. I feel like you have you've got their spirit. You're awesome.
I like the way the main reason this is so much more fun to me is you're tying, you know, the history. We got the history of Jesse and the Templar and all that, but you tie the problems and relate those to modern day problems. Yes. And it's the same story, different players. And that's eventually somebody through and the reason I always have hope, even in the worst times, personally or nationally, there's always going to be somebody rise up and set things straight, or at least lead the way for everybody else to see that you can set things straight.
That's right. That's right. And with that, Gerald, my producer, and thank you, listeners of Ramona Speaks, The Other Truth, all you other truthers out there, I want to wish you all a good night and stay safe. Gerald, take me home.
I love that.
I did too.
I love that. That was you.
This was a great show, you guys.
What part of Texas do you live in?
Pardon?
What?
What part of Texas do you live in?
I live in Hempstead, the watermelon capital, right outside of Houston.
Oh, nice.